Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. The federal government has announced plans to cut the number of new permanent residents from 485,000 this year to 395,000 in 2025, with further cuts to come. Will this help stabilize population growth and relieve pressure on the housing markets? And what about the impact this could have on immigrants and their rights? I'm Amy Bell, in for Michelle Elliott, and this is BC Today. And thank you for joining us on radio, TV, and live streaming. You can call us now on our top story. What impact will the new immigration plans have? Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also call us at 1-800-825-5950 or hit pound 690 or email us today at bctoday@cbc.ca. This morning, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that the federal government is significantly reducing immigrant targets for 2025 through to 2027. This new plan is said to help stabilize population growth and relieve pressure on the housing market.
Today, we're announcing that we will reduce the number of immigrants we bring in over the next 3 years, which will result in a pause in the population growth over the next 2 years. This builds on our previously announced measures to cap international student permits and reform the temporary foreign worker program, all of which we are implementing with a single aim: stabilize our population growth to give all levels of government time to catch up. Time to make the necessary investments in healthcare, in housing, in social services to accommodate more people in the future.
So we want to hear from you. What's your reaction to the newly announced federal immigration cuts? And what impact will the new immigration plan have on prospective immigrants? Call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. And you can email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. For more now, we're joined by Barbara Jo Caruso, co-president, Canadian Immigration Lawyers Association. Barbara Jo, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Oh, I think we're just having some technical issues. I am not able to hear you. We'll just work on getting that up and running. But once again, we're just waiting in standby to hear from Barbara Jo Caruso, co-president, Canadian Immigration Lawyers Association. And what we're talking about today is, of course, the reaction to the newly announced immigration plans that were announced by the federal government earlier today. They are planning on reducing the numbers from this year's close to 500,000 to 397,000, I believe, for next year. 395,000, down from this year's 485,000. And we're asking you, what is your reaction to this announcement? Do you think this will help with relieving pressure on the housing market and stabilize population growth? I am joined, hopefully this time, by Barbara Jo Caruso, co-president, Canadian Immigration Lawyers Association. Hi, Barbara Jo.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. So sorry about that. So, Barbara Jo, your organization has said this announcement is, quote, a dark day for Canada. What is behind that?
Well, I think what's behind it is that immigrants are being targeted as the problem, when really they should be seen as the solution. And our association would oppose the caps that cause chaos and uncertainty in the immigration process for those that are involved in it, whether you're an employer or a newcomer to Canada. When there are caps, it creates uncertainty, and a lot of people have invested a lot of money to come to Canada as students. A lot of companies have invested in training foreign workers and graduates, foreign student graduates, and they have no certainty of what the future holds. This is just yet another sort of short-term answer to what really needs to be a very long-term focused strategic plan.
Mhm. And federal immigration minister Mark Miller has said the lower immigration numbers could help to stabilize the housing market, and with these lower immigration numbers, Canada will need to build, 670,000 fewer homes by 2027. That, along with the high unemployment rate among young people and newcomers, has been cited as the reasoning behind the cuts. How I'm curious, how does government policy sort of align with current economic conditions?
Well, I think the problem with the idea that you turn off the faucets and new immigrants or new people stop coming, you still have a flood here. There are, tens of thousands of temporary foreign workers and foreign students that are in Canada, and the program is designed to select those to become permanent residents after they're already in Canada working or having studied.
Mm,
So they're here already, and we need those homes. We need the infrastructure regardless. So capping the numbers and lowering the overall permanent residence for the next couple of years is going to mean many of those people that are here temporarily are going to have to leave, or they'll go into the shadows and underground where they're not paying taxes, where they're vulnerable.
mm,
They may make refugee claims, they may make H&C claims. Employers may be enticed or feel desperate that they want to help and employ people without continued authorization. So this is the chaos and the dark cloud that we think the next 3 years
mm.
we'll see with these reductions.
Okay. I'd like to bring in one of our audience members now, Kim in Vancouver. Hi, Kim. How are you? What are your thoughts on the new immigration plan?
Hello, and thank you for answering my call. And I hope you're having a great day. I just think it's not enough. I think it needs to be looked at, like even forensically. I just got tired of hearing my nephews and nieces talk about not being able to find jobs at fast food restaurants because of, i.e., number one, the foreign worker program. And also, too, when I hear a lawyer say that this is a bad thing, well, she gets paid, and there are several different agencies and lawyers that concentrate on bringing people to Canada. And I'm talking the foreign worker program. They come here. We've got 1 million plus of them here right now. Let's stop all immigration totally, I believe, and just deal with the million plus that are here already. Thank you.
All right, Kim, thank you. And Barb Jo, I'll let you respond to that. That sentiment that people can't find jobs because they are already being occupied, perhaps by immigrants, or stopping immigration completely, as Kim suggested.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear Tim's question, but I think I can speak to it. Um, you know, I think, again, some of the short-term policies that were made during the pandemic created the situation where you had people coming on the pretense that they were going to study here, given the opportunity to work full time while they studied. That was one of the changes that the Liberal government made during the pandemic to try to address the fact that there seemed to be labor shortages and people weren't coming back to work after the pandemic. But that short-term policy ended up, I think, being very abused, and it has been rolled back. And there have been a number of changes this year, but the government hasn't given the system time to see those
Mm,
changes. So the public hasn't had an opportunity to see those changes. And so understandably, the public's trust in the system is has been impacted and is lower because they see the fraud and they see issues around integrity.
mm. I do have an email from Bruce, and Bruce writes, finally, a lower maximum number of immigrants. We need to get enough housing built first to accommodate Canadians, and then more housing for new immigrants. We don't want new immigrants to Canada to have to sleep on the street or in shelters which are already overcrowded. Some immigrants may have the skills to help build new housing required, and they should be at the front of the line and their applications accepted. Barbara Jo, again, I turn to you for a reaction to that.
Yeah, well, I would agree that construction is an industry that has for many years now had challenges with bringing in new workers in Canada to fill those positions. And a retiring workforce as well. Healthcare is another sector that is really challenged. So the caller or emailer is correct, and that those are areas that should be prioritized. The problem is with these caps that those occupations may still be negatively impacted. And a lot of those workers are already here in Canada, working in nursing homes and hospitals, working on construction sites. And if they're not able to transition to permanent residence because there's a lower number given out every year, then we're going to lose that workforce.
Right. I do have another caller on the line, this time from Allison in Victoria. Hi, Allison.
Hi.
And what are your thoughts on today's topic?
It's knee-jerk management, crisis management. The adults need to start taking over, and we need to do planning, critical thinking. This is just, it's nonsense.
I can hear your frustration, Allison.
Pardon?
I can hear your frustration with the situation, and I'll have Barbara Jo perhaps offer her insight.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, I sympathize, and I agree that what we're seeing and people are seeing in their backyards and in their neighborhoods is sort of a chaotic approach. And again, it has to do with a lot of short-term decision making. Last year, this government reduced the criteria without notice for people applying for visitors visas. So that resulted in a huge uptake in people coming to Canada that didn't have the financial means to support themselves during their visit, and that had intentions to stay permanently, made refugee claims. So they did that to clear out a backlog, another problem. So every time they introduce a new idea or a new policy to solve one problem, it creates another problem. And this needs to be a more thoughtful approach and a more controlled approach so that there is integrity in the system and the public isn't frustrated and the public has confidence. But when these like temporary short-term policies are introduced and they create other problems, it's understandable that the public confidence is eroded.
And we would love to have more input from the public and from our audience. You can always join. Let us know how you feel about this new immigration plan and what impact you feel it'll have on immigration here. You can call us at 1-800-825-5950 or hit pound 690. And our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. And we do have a call now from Gail in Maple Ridge. Hi, Gail. How are you feeling after today's immigration announcement?
Hi.
Hi.
I already gave some of my opinion, but I think it's about time. However, I believe that doctors should be kept separate from this cap because we need them so desperately. and they are educated and financially stable when they come into the country. A lot of the immigrants are financially stable, but the problem is the number of immigrants that the government is letting in. It affects the housing market. It affects even the food banks. There just isn't enough housing for our own young people. They simply cannot afford to rent even a one-bedroom apartment in Vancouver is way out of reach for most of them. So I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's 5 years past its time. And I'm sorry that the Trudeau government has left it until now to do this, because it's just vote grabbing. But I think in this case, it's good vote grabbing. I can't express myself very well, but I really believe that it's far past its time. We've been letting them flood the country, and they haven't been vetted well enough. You can see the number of terrorists that have come in.
Well, I don't know that we want to be pointing the finger in that direction at this point, Gail, but I do thank you for your call, and you do make some valid points. And Barbara Jo, she said maybe we should look at allowing, doctors. There should be a different cap for them. Are we in danger, though, of sort of picking and choosing, who we think can come in, who can stay, and whether we feel they are worthy of being in Canada?
Well, she made some good points. She made the point that this was a vote grab, and that's exactly, I think, what it is. And I think the point that's missing is that we've got to this point from the policies of the past 10 years that weren't paying a big enough attention to what was going on in the foreign student sector. And, the minister tried to say that he trusted his provincial counterparts in the Ministry of Education to manage that, and that they've mismanaged it. But at the end of the day, the federal government knew what those foreign student numbers were, and they should have done something earlier to curtail. I think we do have the right to pick and choose who comes.
Okay.
But that requires consultation with economists. It requires consultation with municipalities and provincial governments to understand what the needs are and what the challenges are in infrastructure. And it's like there's been a total disconnect.
Right.
As the numbers have gone up, none of that other conversation seems to have taken place. And so now, my association, CELA, would say it's unfair to point the finger at immigrants as being the problem. They actually need to be a big part of the solution, because they do come and fill jobs that many Canadians don't want to take.
Sure.
They do pay taxes and contribute as older people age and are no longer working and paying taxes. So they need to be part of the solution and not singled out as the problem.
Right. And some have pointed to higher immigration numbers preventing Canada from going into a deep recession. But also, to your point of who we sort of pick to come in, we also need to make sure those highly skilled workers don't face barriers to working in their fields once they get here. I do have time for one more call, this time from Michael in Kamloops. Hi, Michael.
Hello.
Hi. What are your thoughts on the immigration plans?
Well, just as I was speaking with the producer, there's a net migration out of Canada. Apparently, the number is 125,000 to the U.S., and actually, the U.S. is turning down thousands of other applications. So we're losing, obviously, the competent, capable people, because they have to be economically self-sufficient in order to move to the U.S. But in respect to the temporary foreign workers, I'm retired, but I've been offered work in those situations because they say you kind of guy has a work ethic, and the young people that typically occupy those positions that are Canadian born perhaps will move on, whereas the temporary foreign workers, and I know the Restaurant Association has spoken to this, they're there, they're reliable, they're sustainable. But I see the also the need, and it was spoken to, for example, I know a veterinarian, he's in Cuba and he's highly competent, and there are other specialty trades, healthcare workers, et cetera, that we could perhaps focus on. And there's a labor market needs assessment, as this lawyer would point out. Anyway, when they do make application to show that they in fact are going to be an asset. So all in all, I think immigration itself has become a bit of a whipping boy here. We definitely need to fill these vacancies, and I understand there's a housing issue, but I think overall they bring value to our country and will help us prosper economically. Maybe even do startup businesses, which will provide employment and increase the tax base.
I appreciate those sentiments, Michael. And Barbara Jo, we are out of time for today. I wish we had more time. It's obviously people have a lot of varying thoughts on this topic, but I really thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
That is Barbara Jo Caruso, co-president, Canadian Immigration Lawyers Association. It is 12:27, and this is BC Today. And we asked you earlier this week, can the parties work together in the legislature? How can we bridge the polarization? Steve writes from Cranbrook, if I may generalize for a moment, the political right is almost never interested in working cooperatively with any governing party on the left. And John Rustad wasted no time saying that if his party does not have a majority, he would work hard to bring down the government at every opportunity. I think that tells you where his priorities lie, so finding any common ground is very unlikely for the two major parties. Patrick writes from Penticton, I am a 40-year-old man who was raised in a Liberal household. I have only voted Liberal in the past, both provincially and federally. That changed this provincial election. I disagree with a lot of policies coming from the federal Liberals and the provincial NDP, and when I question any of these policies, I was ganged up on and name-called. We need to get back to nuanced conversations around complicated subject matter. As long as the left continues to reduce itself to a party of shaming those who agree with its policies, the polarization will continue. And Jeffrey writes from Denman Island, everybody seems to want there to be polarization in BC politics, even when there isn't any. The BC Conservatives are adopting positions similar to those of the extreme right elsewhere, but it takes two diametrically opposed poles to have polarization, which, if it were true in BC, the NDP would counter with equally extreme positions on the left. But the NDP is more centrist and moderate than ever before. The real question is why the Conservatives choose to take such extreme positions, not whether BC politics is polarized. And we thank you for those thoughts. And this is BC Today. I'm Amy Bell, sitting in for Michelle Elliott, and it is time for the CBC News with Robert Zimmerman.
As we've been hearing on the show, the federal government says it will cut immigration levels over the next couple of years. The number of immigrants accepted will be cut by 105,000 next year, then another 15,000 in each of the following 2 years. And more police in BC will soon be wearing body cameras. 7 communities, including Ucluelet, Prince George, and Kamloops, will be joining a national pilot project. Mounties say the cameras will provide an independent, unbiased way to capture police interactions with the public. And now the BC forecast on the north coast, mainly cloudy this afternoon with a high of 9, highs around 6 and mainly sunny in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 7, highs to 8 degrees with lots of sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, sunny with a high of 11. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria and the Fraser Valley, increasing cloudiness this afternoon with highs around 10 degrees. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
It's more on the day's top stories on the afternoon shows in your region. Here in Metro Vancouver, here's what's coming up on the coast.
It's Gloria Makarenko here, and I'd love for you to join us for On the Coast this afternoon. We're going to hear about a police investigation that looks like something out of the show Breaking Bad. We'll hear about BC drug labs producing fentanyl. Lots of fentanyl. We're going to hear from Sergeant Derek Westwick with the Clandestine Laboratory Enforcement and Response Team. And it's Thursday, so time for Soapbox Social. Mo Amir, he was a big part of CBC's election night coverage. He'll be here along with Kyla Lee. We'll talk about the winners and the losers in the BC election, as far as we know so far, and all of the other storylines that came out of that election event. Join us for On the Coast between 3 and 6.
On CBC Radio 1 in Metro Vancouver and anywhere on the CBC News app. So to recap, the federal government is cutting the projected number of new permanent residents from 485,000 this year to 395,000 in 2025, with further cuts to come. So we are looking at people's reactions to the newly announced cuts and getting a general feel for what people feel this will do to impact immigrants. Right now, we are joined by Syed Hussain, Executive Director, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, and spokesperson for the Migrant Rights Network. Hi, Syed. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So what was your reaction to today's announcement?
You know, the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems with this announcement, is how it's being framed as a response to the housing and affordability crisis. And that's just scapegoating migrants for the failures of the provinces and the failures of the federal government and the runaway profiteering by the super rich. The other thing is that these cuts are happening on the back of other cuts where cumulatively the government is saying 1.2 million people in the country will have their permits expire by next year, who won't be able to renew it, who won't be able to get permanent resident status. These are people who have lived here for many, many years, who've laid roots, who were promised permanent residency, who in fact completed the requirements for permanent residency. Some have even applied for permanent residency, but now they're going to either remain temporary or they will have to make the very difficult choice to leave their families and communities here and go back to places where potentially their lives may be in danger, or they might stay. And if they stay, they will become undocumented and face greater exploitation. So this does nothing good for migrants. It does not address the housing and affordability crisis, but what it does do is allow the federal government, who is down in the polls, to basically push forward conservative-like anti-immigrant policies in an attempt to win back public support, which they won't. They're trying to be like the conservatives, pushing forward anti-immigrant policies, scapegoating migrants, and it's just not right.
And we did hear just recently from immigration lawyer Barbara Jo Caruso, and she was referring, I believe, what you're referring to, that this could move immigrants into the shadows of having even less rights because they don't have that government protection in order to stay. And I know Migrant Rights Network sent an open letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Immigration Minister Mark Miller earlier today. What are the key, I guess, topics that you want them to understand?
So the list today is signed by over 100 civil society organizations, including every major labor, climate, healthcare, faith, and legal organization, who are saying that we do have a consensus in this country in support of migrants and immigrants, that we need an actual resolution to the housing and affordability crisis, and we need permanent resident status for migrants. We need an end to exploitative closed work permits, and we need regularization of undocumented people, but that those two issues are not linked. And it's incredibly upsetting that the federal government is actually conceding to a loud minority that has been pushing forward this completely false idea that we have a problem of too many people, not enough homes. We have a problem of homes that are simply not being built by speculators and developers who want to increase their profit, and they will just continue to do that.
And whether it is a loud majority or a minority or majority, we heard that from our callers in our past segment, that they do feel that immigrants are, quote, taking jobs from people that were born here, and that they're making it impossible to find housing. How do you work against those misconceptions?
I mean, absolutely. People believe this because they have been told this. They have been told this by mainstream media all across the country for the last year. But only in the last year, because a year ago, nobody was linking the housing and affordability crisis, which was incredibly bad, to immigration. This is an actual attempt. I mean, if you look, for example, to President Trump in the United States, and you ask him what his housing policy is, he says reduce the number of immigrants. You ask the federal liberals what their housing policy is, it is to reduce the number of immigrants. This is a global phenomena where extreme right-wing movement has been pushing this misinformation to people. And of course, working people like you and I, we are all struggling. The wages are low, the prices are high. We want to know who's responsible. When the government and the media tell us it's immigrants, of course we'll blame immigrants. It's the fault of the governments that are doing that. It's the fault particularly of provincial governments that are responsible for housing policy, education policy, healthcare policy. These are the ones who should have been held responsible, but you hear them say not a word today. What they have done is they've basically managed to trick all of us into blaming immigrants so that we don't blame them. Right now, it's grocery store barons who have raised the prices of food far beyond what inflation. It is those same massive employers who've been laying out tens of thousands of people from jobs. And while CEO pay in Canada is higher than ever before, income inequality is higher than ever before. So we are struggling. We're looking for answers. And this simple story that's being pushed on us is the one that's the problem. And the federal government today has decided to pander to that story. And the reality is it won't change. Look, migrants, for example, temporary foreign workers live in employer-controlled housing. They're not actually competing for the housing market. If you look at the overall rate of employment growth, it's 3.9% in the last 2 years. The rate of increase of housing prices is 20%, right? There is a correlation between the two, but there is no causation. The numbers are too high. You don't expect, less than 4% increase to result in a 20% increase. These kinds of public education that needs to happen on the housing is the fact that over the last 10 years, speculators and developers have entered into the market like never before. 500,000 affordable units of housing have been bought, refurbished, and sold back into the market. These aren't like individuals flipping apartments. I'm talking about massive multi-million-dollar global companies have been doing that to hundreds of thousands of housing units. So they have artificially reduced the supply of housing. Here in the GTA, there is 18 months of housing supply available and not enough buyers. It's not too many people, not enough homes. It's literally the opposite. There are too many homes and no one's buying. But we have been misled and misinformed. And so we are blaming migrants and immigrants, and this will hurt everyone.
Unfortunately, Syed, that is the all the time that we have for today, but I'm sure we will be touching base with you in the very near future. I thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
That is Syed Hussain, Director, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and spokesperson for the Migrant Rights Network. And we are coming up to the weekend before Halloween, and that means you're maybe getting yourself psychologically hyped to watch a scary movie. The Vancouver Horror Film Show is returning this weekend to Cineplex International Village Cinemas in downtown Vancouver. Now, there will be 4 feature films, 2 short programs, panel discussions, and a live taping of the CBC podcast, Let's Make a Horror. And we'll be joined from a guest of the festival in a moment. But we're asking you, what kind of horror film is your favorite? Do you prefer those classic slasher films, comedic horror movies, psychological thrillers, or movies with maybe social commentary running underneath? And what is your horror movie recommendation? Call us 1-800-825-5950. 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. And you can email bctoday@cbc.ca. We have 2 festival passes to give away to a lucky caller. Now, joining me now is Rylan Friday, a director, curator, writer, and producer from Cote First Nation in Saskatchewan and curator of the Indigenous Voices in Horror program of the Vancouver Horror Show Film Festival. That is a mouthful. You're very accomplished. Hello, Rylan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm assuming that you are a horror film fan as well.
Yes and no, because I'm such a major wimp when it comes to watching
Oh,
horror.
really?
I remember watching The Substance about last week or the week prior, and just body horror just kind of just made me shudder,
Yeah.
and just my jacket was just over my eyes. But I just love the feeling and just the tension. But yeah, stepping into the horror genre space was just so unexpected in my filmmaking career.
So you didn't grow up as sort of a horror movie aficionado?
It's a combination of loving the old school slasher films like Scream,
Yeah.
I Don't Know What You Did Last Summer,
Yep.
Leprechaun, but also just to name one, but also just hearing the stories that my late grandfather Daniel Cashane would tell me of the spooky stuff that would happen on the res.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there is, that supernatural element, and we do hear that in so many tales that are shaled by, perhaps Indigenous elders. How did that sort of, I guess, almost inform or impact the way that you interpret horror movies?
Well, the one question I've been posing with this curation, with this panel, and of course the Don't Look Back Indigenous horror shorts
Yep.
was, what is horror from an Indigenous perspective?
And are we talking, do we touch on those real life horrors that Indigenous people have experienced from genocide and residential schools? These are very real horrors.
Definitely. And the one thing I want to get across is that old school tropes from the 80s, 90s, 70s, including the Indian burial ground,
Mm-hmm.
is just not okay with the social appetite, including the mass graves that started coming up in the past 3 years, and even murdered and missing, and racism and the casual racism of micro and macro aggressions. That is the real horror story. And I think that's why it just works so well within the stories that we're weaving, because the lived experience of anyone who's marginalized, including Indigenous people, is 100% valid. And I do feel that Indigenous horror is becoming more prominent in the filmscape, but also in the literary world as well.
And I guess in a broader sense, using horror to sort of make those social commentaries, especially for Indigenous issues, but society at large. It's a unique way to sort of put a spotlight on very real horrors in perhaps a very over dramatized arena.
Horror is such a underrepresented and underutilized like social template just to add that commentary. Like we have like films and the Don't Look Back curation, which is screening on Sunday afternoon between 2 and 4. We have like one film by Eva Thomas, which is called Red Lights, which also is so complex. It's tension heavy, and it's essentially about murdered and missing and the Starlight Tours, for example.
Wow. We'd love to have people join our conversation about horror films. Of course, we want to hear your horror movie recommendations in the lead up to Halloween, but we also want to hear your thoughts on using horror movies to sort of shed light on very real horrors and atrocities that do happen in the everyday world. And I guess what do you prefer? Do you still want horror movies to be an escape, or do you want them to be more of a social commentary? You can, of course, call us always at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. We're joined by Rylan Friday. Now, Rylan, your short film, Terror Forming, has screened at Vancouver International Film Fest, Maryland Film Festival, and Imagine Native Film and Media Arts Festival. It also won Best Short Horror Film at last year's London Independent Film Festival. Wow, congratulations.
Thank you, Miigwech.
What has that experience been like?
Well, it's been interesting because like it came from out of nowhere during the pandemic, and of course like the film is told in a continuous shot type feel about like an interracial gay couple, and essentially it just wanted to get that Indigenous perspective in real time as we navigate hostile spaces that hold tension. And I think it's just like a dialogue that like the casual racism of the boyfriend's ineptitude of understanding the Indigenous partner's culture.
Right.
It just gets so swept under the rug, and it's so relatable. And it's interesting because the film is about micro and macro aggressions, and it already illuminates the divide that exists. And I've unfortunately experienced racism from certain film festivals in Vancouver, whether it's the queer or short film festivals. And I felt that it was great that Megan and Dave at Vancouver Horror are giving me this platform. And I'm just reclaiming that space with this film and with this curations that I'm having on Sunday.
I'm so glad that you're having that opportunity. In terms of the horror genre, is it looked down upon? Is it not seen as sort of a worthy type of film that could deliver a very powerful and real life message? Does it somehow get judged for not being, cerebral enough or put in a different, I know sometimes, we'll see a dramatic movie, but we don't hold it, or we hold a comedy movie to a lesser standard. Do we still see that with horror movies, that they're sort of seen as, something that teenagers should watch and just good for a scream?
I personally feel that horror films are so easily written off as either cheap or kitschy, but it's also dependent on like word of mouth, because like certain films that don't do well in the box office are become eventually cult favorites over the years. And it's also, what does the marketing look like and what are the demographics? It's so many things that are in play, but sometimes there's films that are just not good in the cinema space, and I usually look towards like what's more independent and
Right.
just like what's on Shutter, or like what's like being more prominently like being instilled and featured within the indie film festival scene, to be honest. But I do agree that even like holding horror to a higher standard is so far away.
Right.
Like it was a huge victory when The Exorcist was nominated for all these Oscars, and it's shown like what the power of like filmmaking and effects can do.
Right.
But I also feel that people are too afraid to venture out of the box because like horror is such a unique template that filmmakers can just take it further and further with the subject matter, the themes, or just like with the scares. And I don't feel people are ready for that.
Interesting. Interesting too that you mentioned The Exorcist. So many people, and myself included, sort of cite that as a horror movie that had a deep impact on that. I remember I watched it when I think I was 13. I was homesick. My mom was like, "Yeah, I'll rent it for you. You can watch whatever you want." And so I watched it after they'd gone to bed. Was terrified. I don't think I moved from the couch for like 8 hours. I wouldn't move until it was light out to go to the bathroom or anything. And it stuck with me for years.
That's so funny because I remember I was in grade 6. I saw The Exorcist, scared the bejesus out
We're
of
way
me.
too young.
But I don't know why, like, I felt the need to put it on after school for a week. Like, when I was like, it was just like, am I a little weirdo? Like, am I more so interested in the filmmaking? But I remember my mom was just like, okay, we're returning it. It's a rental. And I was just like, yeah, I'm not normal.
I love that. You had good taste from a very, very early age. You were just like, I've got to see what this means, what this means. What do you think of some of the newer horror movies we're seeing? 'Cause, I mean, The Exorcist has been a staple since the 70s. Where are we now with some more maybe recent horror films that you think have really, they've done it right?
Well, one film that surprised me was Talk to Me, which is a film from Australia, and I just felt tense the entire time. But
Okay.
it was also just tragic and beautiful with the cinematography, the score, and just the attention to detail. And same with The Substance, to be honest. And it's just like a commentary on like a women's like beauty standards in the film industry. It was unhinged and it kept pushing the envelope. And I went with a friend who doesn't like needles, and I'm not a big fan of body horror, but I love it. And it was just so nice to feel the energy of the crowd. And as well as what Jordan Peele's doing with like representation of like African American and the Black experience in horror, since the Indigenous experience and the Black experience are cut from the same cloth
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, very similar in some very, very real horrors. You have curated the Indigenous Voices in Horror for the Vancouver Horror Film Festival. What audience reaction are you hoping for in the theater?
For people to open up their horizons a little bit more and their views, because like I know that Indigenous like representation in the horror space still has like a long way to go, and it also adds this social commentary as well on who has the right to tell our stories in that space, because I'm tired of the Wendigo being used again and again
Right.
in other parts of Turtle Island where it doesn't belong, like Guillermo del Toro, he produced Antlers, where it's set in like Portland, Oregon, and that's an entity and a story and a mythological being that's not from there, but more so from the Plains and Great Lakes. And I just don't like the fact that like the horror genre pan-indigenizes Indigenous people, because we are so vibrant with our stories and culture.
This sort of amalgamating you all to sort of, I guess, or cherry pick the horrors and apply them to anyone.
Exactly.
Interesting. Do you think that we're seeing a resurgence or a growing interest in horror?
I personally feel that Jeff Barnaby kicked the door open for us. He unfortunately passed away in the past couple years, but what he did with Blood Quantum, with his like zombie horror film,
Incredible.
where Indigenous people are immune to a zombie outbreak, and
Yep.
it's this dialogue of like what the smallpox and various diseases did to Indigenous communities. And I do feel that like there's small pockets and more films coming out. Like we had Seeds that came out, which is more like a horror thriller.
Yep.
But it's also great to see what Shane Hawk is doing with like his horror anthology, Don't Whistle at Night, and what Stephen Graham Jones is doing with The Only Good Indians in the literary space, and same with like Adriana Chartrand as well, with A Casual Violence. It's just great to see all these types of media be coming out of the woodwork now because we feel safe to tell our stories.
Well, and I suppose that's it too. Is it's feeling safe to tell those stories, and in a sense, horror has always been there. It's almost a way for these taboo subjects to have some exposure. I think I look back at some older horror movies, like say Carrie, and that obviously it's terrifying with this telekinetic teen, but the bigger issue is that terror of how women are treated and sexuality and how that impacts their interactions in society, and you sort of you view it through a different lens at different points in your life, but it does impress on you a very scary and important topic, which may not have been accepted in other genres at that time.
The most interesting thing about the Don't Look Back horror shorts, Indigenous horror shorts curation, is that 5 out of the 7 films are directed by sorry, I'm getting like feedback. Indigenous women. It's messing me up.
and I think that's wonderful because we always have had these scream queens, these poor women in horror movies where awful things are inflicted upon them. It's kind of nice to see women getting to be behind the scenes and actually get to tell the tale.
Yeah, well, when I was talking about it with Megan and Dave at VHS, like it just dawned on me that 5 out of the 7 filmmakers are Indigenous women dealing with like female specific issues as well. And of course, when you look at it from a systemic issue, there's that like Indigenous women are the most vulnerable. And I'm also just so happy that it came as a nice surprise because like I was also looking at the stories and just like the craftsmanship that is applied, but also putting a platform and raising those more so marginalized voices under the banner of indigeneity as well.
Oh, I love that. And Rylan, it's been such a treat to talk to you, and best of luck with everything.
Thank you.
Rylan Friday, a director, curator, writer, and producer from Cote First Nation of Saskatchewan and curator of the Indigenous Voices in Horror program of the Vancouver Horror Show Film Festival. And we can get the passes to one lucky winner. And that is our show for today. Thank you, as always, for calling and joining the discussion. And you can always email us, bctoday@cbc.ca.